The Avalon, an interstellar spaceship, was headed to a colonized world called Homestead 2, with its 258 crew members and 5,000 passengers in hibernation. While on autopilot, the ship encountered an asteroid belt that weakened its shields, causing power to be diverted to the main shield. Later, the ship collided with a giant asteroid, which led to several malfunctions. The ship's self-repair system began functioning, but one of the hibernation pods unexpectedly activated and woke up Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer who had been in suspended animation for 101 years. Jim was informed that the ship was only 4 months away from Homestead 2 and that he could spend this time enjoying the ship's luxuries. He was given instructions on his ID band, cabin, and activities he was expected to participate in before reaching their destination. Jim felt both excited and nervous to meet the other people on the ship. He left his cabin and entered an automated classroom that was designed for group learning. The hologram began explaining the situation on Earth, describing it as overpopulated, overpriced, and overrated. The hologram instructed Jim to hold his questions until the end of the lesson, but he couldn't resist asking why he was the only one there. After realizing the hologram couldn't answer his questions, he left the classroom to search for other people on the ship. Jim arrived at the ship's main concourse but found that no one was there. He approached an automated informational desk and asked to talk to a real person. The desk directed him to a steward, but when Jim couldn't find one, he asked to speak to the captain. Despite not having clearance to enter the captain's quarters, Jim could see that none of the main crew members were awake either. After wandering around the ship, Jim arrived at the observatory and discovered that the ship was actually 90 years away from Homestead 2, much further than he had been led to believe. Realizing that he had woken up prematurely, Jim hurried back to the concourse and sent a message to Earth, seeking advice on how to get back into hibernation. However, the costly message informed him that he would have to wait approximately 55 years to receive a response. Jim was devastated by the news. As he walked around the ship, he stumbled upon the bar and was surprised to see another person there. As he spoke to the bartender, he began to notice that something was off about him. It eventually became clear to Jim that the bartender was actually an android named Arthur. Although Jim wanted to learn more about his situation from the android, he was unable to explain how he had awakened from hibernation early. The following day, Jim visited the cantina and discovered that many of the items on the menu were only available to gold-class passengers. After getting a simple cup of coffee, he focused on finding a solution for his hibernation pod. He gathered the necessary tools and attempted to fix it, but was unsuccessful. Jim then attempted to access the crew's hibernation chambers with the tools he had found, but this also proved to be unsuccessful. Various minor issues arose on the ship, and Jim found himself returning to the bar to talk to Arthur and drink. The android offered him some advice that led Jim to break into one of the gold-class rooms and enjoy some of the ship's amenities. He tried all of the restaurants, games, and entertainment systems, but as time passed, he became increasingly unhappy being alone on the ship. Jim roams around the hibernation pods and becomes captivated by a woman named Aurora, who is in one of the pods. He looks for her files in the directory and is smitten with her after listening to her passenger interview. Jim is fascinated by the irony of his situation. He traveled to another planet for a better life, woke up prematurely, found his ideal woman, and then realized that she was out of his reach. He discusses waking Aurora up with Arthur, but the android fails to grasp the ethical dilemma. If Jim awakens her, he would be condemning her to die on the ship with him. Initially, Jim decides not to wake her, but he can't shake his desire to do so. Eventually, he hacks into Aurora's pod and changes its settings, causing it to malfunction and awaken her. Jim lies to Aurora about what happened and convinces her that her pod malfunctioned on its own. They try to fix her pod together but fail. Jim decides to show her around the ship and takes her on a date. They go for a spacewalk, and Jim tells her the truth about waking her up. At first, she's angry with him, but over time they start to bond. Jim spends most of his time with Aurora, showing her all the ship's luxuries, and they fall in love. But their relationship becomes strained when Aurora finds out the truth about Jim's actions. She feels betrayed and starts avoiding him, refusing to talk to him. Jim tries to apologize and explain, telling her that he fell in love with her, but Aurora can't forgive him for taking her life. She goes over to Jim's cabin one night and punches and kicks him, wanting to kill him. Jim seeks to grant Aurora a taste of her ideal life on Homestead 2. Once she starts to come to terms with their circumstances, he secretly gains access to the ship's systems and creates a simulated world featuring a virtual beach and dance floor. Aurora is overjoyed by this, and the two spend hours enjoying their virtual paradise, including dancing, movie watching, basketball playing, and conversing with Arthur at the bar. While their connection deepens, Aurora remains acutely aware of their precarious circumstances, which leave her feeling confined and powerless. In an effort to make amends for his earlier transgressions, Jim crafts a scale model of the Chrysler Building, which he presents to her as a surprise in the observatory. They then proceed on a date to the bar, where they exchange stories from their respective pasts. During the conversation, Aurora confides in Jim about the death of her father when she was a teenager. During a spacewalk, Jim turns off the magnets on their boots, allowing Aurora to float freely in space with him. They share a kiss upon returning to the ship, after which Aurora moves into Jim's quarters. Their relationship progresses, and they engage in intimate activities like jogging, dining, and sleeping together. Jim stumbles upon the hydroponics bay and surprises Aurora with a bouquet of flowers. They commemorate her birthday in one of the ship's restaurants, and Jim prepares to propose with a ring he fashioned. However, before he can do so, Aurora learns the truth about why she was awakened from hibernation and reacts with anger and distress, running away from Jim. After Aurora's departure, Jim is filled with remorse and endeavors to make amends with her. One evening, a significant malfunction occurs on the ship, causing the primary command to shut down. As they search for a resolution, Jim and Aurora encounter a tree that Jim had previously planted in the ship's main concourse. Despite their prior disagreements, the two take a moment to admire the life that has flourished aboard the ship. In their efforts to fix the ship, Jim and Aurora team up to locate and seal any additional breaches in the hull. While tracing the asteroid's path, they discover that it has collided with the reactor control computer. Jim believes that he can source replacement components for the damaged computer, so they embark on a quest to scavenge the ship for the necessary parts. Eventually, they locate the component they need and successfully swap it out, but they encounter further issues when trying to vent the reactor. Jim concludes that he must access the vent door from outside the ship to adequately cool the reactor down. Together, Jim and Aurora venture to the airlock, where Jim prepares to exit the ship. Before he embarks on his dangerous mission, Jim entrusts Aurora with Mancuso's bracelet. Sensing that he may not return, Aurora assists him with donning a suit, and as he enters the airlock, she implores him to return, as she cannot bear the thought of being alone on the ship. Meanwhile, Aurora remains in the reactor room, where the temperature has reached a critical level. As Jim approaches the vent from the outside of the ship, Aurora is hit by a bolt from the reactor. Jim continues his attempt to bypass the vent door to open it, but the temperature in the reactor room continues to escalate. Upon realizing that he must manually keep the vent door open for the reactor to properly vent, Jim informs Aurora of the plan. Although she is apprehensive about the idea, Jim proceeds with his plan and instructs her to start the venting process. Aurora is unwilling to sacrifice Jim's life, and they engage in a heated debate, but he insists that saving the other passengers is crucial. The venting process succeeds, but Jim is knocked away by the toxic fumes emanating from the reactor, and his tether snaps, causing his suit's pressure to drop. He informs Aurora of the dire situation, and she rapidly locates another suit to rescue him. Jim offers another apology to Aurora before she hastily puts on a suit to rescue him. Despite her tether being too short, she seizes his tether and successfully drags him back into the ship. They rush to the infirmary, where Aurora discovers that Jim has tragically passed away. In a desperate effort to save him, she uses Mancuso's bracelet to override the medical protocols and initiate a resuscitation procedure. The medical pod works automatically and miraculously brings Jim back to life. Aurora finds it in her heart to forgive him. Subsequently, Jim reveals to Aurora that he has found a means of converting the medical pod into a hibernation pod and advises her to utilize it to ride out the remainder of the voyage. Aurora refuses, opting to remain awake with him. Jim then proposes to her, and they choose to spend their lives together on the ship. 88 years later, when the Avalon reaches Homestead 2, the crew is taken aback by the unexpected condition of the vessel. Aurora records a message for them, recounting the story of her and Jim's lives on the ship, while the rest of the passengers were in hibernation.